Captain Jack, Brawn, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
Hello, welcome to Card Table, Episode 2. I talked a little bit about in the previous post about how it is an anthology. You'll probably see on some websites. I don't think it says it anywhere in this book where they actually call it a novel. What do they actually call it? Just the book that started it all, which I've never really quite understood this tagline. It's like, well, it's book one. I mean, the first book of any series would be the book that started it all. So I'm not sure exactly what it all is in this case, other than this series, in which case, of course, it's book one. Of course, it started it all. Anyway, the first book, it is an anthology more than a novel, probably. I think if you go into it with the expectation that it's a series of short stories set in the same world, I think you'll get a more satisfying reading experience out of it, rather than thinking, oh, all these different short stories are eventually going to merge and intersect. That does happen, but it doesn't really happen until the second and third book, where you start to see more sort of interaction. In this story, there's definitely some of that, and it's very satisfying and very cool, but it's not quite the norm. There's an essay online, which I'll link to, by a guy who, I think he wrote it like 10 years ago, and was like, here's what you need to know about wildcards. I remember fans that I interacted with online were like, oh, this essay sucks, he's such a jerk. Because he wasn't 100% effusive. He was like, here's the stuff that's really cool, here's the stuff I don't like at all about it. And I think some fans were like, how could you possibly think there are things to not like about wildcards? And they got a little... I actually thought it was a very well-written essay, very breezy, kind of casually written, very conversational style. I thought it was a great essay. Maybe I disagreed with some of his criticisms or whatever, but, he clearly wasn't out to trash the series. He was like, I actually really like these books. Here's the things I like. Here are some things that maybe they could have done better. Personally, on this video, since I'm a big fan of the books and a big fan of the authors, I don't plan on focusing too much on elements that I find less satisfying about the series. I think it would be much more fun to talk about the things I really love. But the reason I bring up that essay is because he actually has a great line in there where he talks about how, each writer, what happens in these books is that you've got, in this case, in the original version of the book, you got, I think, 11 writers. And then when Tor republished the book around 2010, George R.R. Martin recruited 3 new writers, new in the sense of new to this book, to write 3 more stories. So now I think there's 14 writers contributing, and I think it ends up being 13 stories. My point being that what happens is each writer comes in and writes about their character that they've created, generally speaking. I don't think there's too many exceptions to that, particularly not in the first book, but sometimes a writer might actually write a character that they didn't create. But more often the rule, and it's a perfectly intuitive rule, obviously, if a writer is writing about a certain character, it's the character that they created. But what this essay pointed out was, these writers, they're novelists. They're people who have written, in some cases, if you look at someone like Walter John Williams or Roger Zelazny, not only capable of writing a whole book on their own and creating a world for one book, but, Walter John Williams and Zelazny, obviously George R.R. Martin, they've written an entire series. Like they're capable just within their own imagination of creating enough interesting characters and situations to populate an entire saga's worth of books all on their own. And then in this series, each of those writers is limited to maybe just 1 short story per book, or maybe 2 at best, in terms of quantity. So they have to squeeze a lot of stuff into a very short amount of space, which means what you get in a book like this is each short story is incredibly dense, and a lot of the characters in these stories are characters who are interesting enough and cool enough they really could have supported a whole book on their own, which is what that essay has pointed out, which again I'll link to in the comments or in the description. But yeah, the fact that it's almost like you're getting like a little excerpt in these 13 stories. Each one almost feels like the excerpt from 13 different novels, So it's incredibly dense in that way, which can only be a good thing. It's one of the reasons I find these books so endlessly rereadable, because every story is just so full of characters, just that one story, and then in the later books, when they all start interacting, it's like all these different universes, all these different authors' imaginations colliding, incredibly satisfying. All of which is a very long-winded way of saying that just about every character in this first book, and almost in every book you could name from the series, of 1 through 29, every character is cool enough and interesting enough that the whole book could have been about them. But instead, you get in one book, all these different characters and situations, and and complications, and story arcs and thematic arcs. Pretty impressive anthology, this first one. The story goes that in the first book, originally back in the 80s, when they wanted to create this series, they already, through the role playing game, they had already created quite a few characters that they wanted to put into the book. Although in many cases they did have to sort of adjust the characters because while they might have made great avatars for RPG, maybe aren't necessarily quite right for a novel. So in many cases, the characters underwent a lot of revisions and changes so that they could fit in this fictional world. One change that came, I guess, kind of late in the process was originally, since the book would be set in 1986 or circa 1986, that their idea of the virus that creates superhumans, the virus that was created by aliens, would come to Earth in 1986 or 85 or somewhere in the 80s. And then Howard Waldrop, who writes the first book in the collection, had this story. Apparently, it was a story that he had wanted to write anyway. If you read, the story is called 30 Minutes Over Broadway, Jet Boy's Last Adventure. It's an homage to a character. The character in the story is named Jet Boy, of course, an homage to Air Boy, a comic book character from the 40s, a pilot, like a teenage pilot, World War II flying ace, heroic pilot who was way too young to go to war, was only like 13 or 14 flying those planes. If you're a fan of Top 10, the Alan Moore comic from the 90s, he had a character in that series called Jet Lad, which was also based on Air Boy. I always thought that was kind of interesting that he went with Jet Lad, because that seems less a play on Air Boy and more a play on Jet Boy, which almost makes you think maybe he was secretly reading Wild Cards. I don't know that he's ever admitted to being a fan of that series, but the Alan Moore Wild Cards parallels, that could be a video all on its own. So maybe at some point I'll do one about that, because there are some interesting coincidences that are maybe coincidences, maybe not, when it comes to some of the parallels with some Alan Moore comics and some Wild Card stuff. So the character is called Jet Boy. It's an homage to Air Boy. It's World War II flying ace. If you read, there's a version of the story, or an edition of the story, in a Howard Waldrop collection that is annotated by Waldrop. So he actually talks about some of his influences and also tells a little of the background about him writing the story. And of course, George R.R. Martin has also written about the background of it. Their two versions of the story don't entirely align. Not that either one is calling the other a liar, but it's just memory plays tricks. So it's interesting to read the two accounts, because they're a little bit off from each other, which makes you wonder, like, how did the conversation really go? But the way Martin puts it is that Howard Waldrop had already talked about this story, an Air Boy homage, and George R.R. Martin had thought, oh, that could be a great story for this Wild Cards anthology. And then it was decided that Waldrop didn't really want to do didn't want to deal with the headaches and the logistics of the shared universe. So he just said, I'll do that story, and then my character will die at the end. And then it was decided that it would be, okay, so in the 1940s, after the war is over, Jet Boy doesn't have anything to do, but then this alien virus is a threat, and so he's the one who has to try and stop the alien virus from being deployed and dispersed over the city of New York. He fails, and he dies. Spoilers. So the end of the first story is the virus infecting Earth. or starting to. And then if you read Howard Waldrop's account, I feel like it's the exact opposite, because Martin says that, oh, Waldrop would always talk about this Airboy story he was planning to write, and I thought, oh, that could work in Wildcards. And I think Waldrop says that, oh, Martin kept on talking about this shared world, this Wildcards shared world that he wanted to do, and I thought, hey, my Jetboy story could fit in that. You get the idea. Either one shakes around to the same point of they were two things that were developing separately, the Wildcards universe and the Jetboy story, and then one of them said, hey, let's put them together. So that's the first story, and so that one is a bit of an aberration in Wildcards, because most of the characters in Wildcards, once they're introduced, they're around, sometimes for, in some cases for one book after another over, the many decades that the series has existed. Jetboy is kind of an aberration because he dies at the end of the first one and then he's gone. So from there, but then the other part of that was that the whole idea of the virus coming to Earth in the 80s didn't work anymore. So now it was going to be, because Jetboy was a 1940s character, now it meant that the virus exploded over New York in the 40s. So Wildcards 1 became this anthology of basically taking you through the decades, starting in the 40s, and at the time, the 1980s were the present. So to get from the 1940s to the present didn't take as long as it would nowadays. It was only 4 decades worth of history, of American history, to get through. So what they end up doing, which I always thought was very cool, is they sort of, through each story, they go forward in time, and you get these little sort of snapshots of the Wildcard universe during different decades, starting in the 40s, working through the 50s, and I started the sentence and now I have to finish it, and then the 60s, and then the 70s, and then the 80s. You probably could have figured out where that sentence was going. And then this book, the tour version, where they got 3 new stories, they sort of plugged in some more stories in there. I think there's a pretty big jump. Originally, there's like a jump from like early 1950s, maybe even 1950, all the way to like 1963 or something like that. So this story gets this edition of the novel, or of the anthology, I should say, gets a few more stories there. In the 50s, there's one set in 56, and then another one set in 1960. And then there's a real cool one near the end by Carrie Vaughn, set in the early 80s, kind of new wave punk era, where they go to CBGB's. And I always love, it doesn't happen too often, but I always love whenever they sort of look at like a music scene, or what an iconic music scene, whether that's like 60s British Invasion or the punk new wave movement of the 80s. And they do a Wildcard story where they sort of mix superheroics and sci-fi with music, or a musical style, or a musical genre, or a musical era. I always think that's really cool. Oddly enough, I believe that the last George R.R. Martin book before Wildcards 1 was a book that mixed science fiction with sort of meditations on the 60s era of rock and roll. That sort of, whatever you would call that sort of psychedelic era. The Armageddon Rag is the name of the book. So the characters. So the first character is a character called the Sleeper, created by Roger Zelazny, a character who, the gimmick there, it's interesting, it's curious. I always thought it was interesting that they started with the Sleeper, because he's kind of an exception as well, much like Jetboy was, because Jetboy is a character who has no superpowers at all. He's pre-virus. And then most of the characters that you read about, particularly at first, are aces rather than jokers, aces being just someone with a superhuman power. And so they get infected by the virus, they discover their superpower, and then that power, you see how that affects their life or what they do with that power. That's more the norm, but they open with the Sleeper, who's an exception, where the concept there is that his infection isn't stable. So he wakes up with a superpower, but then he can't fall asleep. He's just awake for days, and then eventually he gets tired again, and he falls into sort of a coma, almost like a metamorphic sort of situation, like a caterpillar butterfly situation where he goes to sleep. Sometimes he sleeps for weeks, and then when he wakes up, he's been reinfected by the virus. So he's got a different superpower, and also looks totally different. The whole concept where there's both aces and jokers, where sometimes you don't get a power from the virus, you get mutated and into some kind of possibly very horrible creature. Sometimes that's what happens to the sleeper. So sometimes he goes to sleep an ace, wakes up as a joker, and isn't too happy about that, and just can't wait to fall asleep again so that he might wake up next time and be an ace again. And he's an evergreen character. One byproduct of his the nature of his condition is that he kind of always wakes up kind of renewed. So he doesn't really age. So he's a character who over the decades kind of always wakes up looking like he's just kind of in his 20s or 30s. Not a bad deal. And so he's one of those characters that they could introduce in the 40s, but then still have him be around. He's sort of, to all intents and purposes, immortal. The authors have even said that it's partly tied up with the fact that Roger Zelazny was the creator, and he was the first Wildcards contributor to pass away, unfortunately, back in 95 or 96. And I know at least one, Melinda Snodgrass for sure has said that, oh yeah, the sleeper's never going to die. Like that's our way of kind of keeping Roger alive. So he'll just keep on waking up in the Wildcards universe with a new look and a new power. Definitely a fan favorite, I think, for Wildcards fans. He can't hold down a job because of the nature of his situation, so he sort of turns to sort of petty crime, and he's or maybe not so petty crime, but well, robberies essentially, just so that he has money. He's essentially a thief who can't really ever get caught because he doesn't necessarily have the same fingerprints when he wakes up. So even the fingerprints that he left during his last robbery aren't going to be enough to convict him next time. So he just kind of is able to sort of float through life and have these adventures. And he's a great character because he turns up sometimes as a supporting character in other people's stories, and he always kind of enlivens them because it's such an interesting concept. From there, in the first book, you go to Golden Boy, who is who is he based on? Ah, shoot. Bummer. I should have looked it up beforehand. Golden Boy is Walter John Williams' story that the character's name is Jack Braun. He wakes up with a very, very 40s comic book kind of power, invulnerability, golden force field that gives him super strength and vulnerability. So he's bulletproof, essentially like an early Superman. Not able to fly, but still pretty impressive. Another character who's ageless. So even though he's comes to prominence in the 1940s, he's another one who's still alive in the present day Wildcards set in the 2010s, 2020s, still looking young and vibrant. Again, another one who a function of his ace power is that he's ageless. It's almost like they were planning ahead with these 40s characters. Like they wanted characters who were ageless if they introduced them in the 40s. Works out nicely. But he's based on an actor. So Jack Braun becomes an adventurer alongside three other aces, called, of course, the Four Aces. And sort of they have adventures kind of trying to make a difference on the world stage, trying to depose dictators, defeat communist regimes, that kind of thing, before eventually realizing the limits of that. He also gets a job as an actor, becomes kind of a Hollywood, or tries to become a Hollywood sensation. And that part of it is because he's modeled after an actor. I'm just going to keep pausing every time I get to this because I don't remember the name of the guy. I'll look it up. I can flash it on the screen or something. But he wrote an autobiography because the climax of the whole Golden Boy story is the HUAC committee, the House Un-American Activities Committee, in their sort of communist witch hunt that swept through a lot of strata of American society, I suppose, but particularly Hollywood. There was some very highly publicized Hollywood trials, and some of the people who were called upon to testify named names. And there's one actor who wrote an autobiography about how he kind of never escaped the guilt. Over decades went by, and he just couldn't escape the guilt of the fact that he had named names at the time, and so that's sort of Golden Boy's cross to bear, because Golden Boy does the same thing, sort of sells out the other three aces, kind of screws them over, and then he ends up untouched at the time because he was a friendly witness. But then, history sort of, as history goes by, he's very much considered the villain, someone who just kind of saved himself by selling out his friends and showed no loyalty. Which I guess is maybe a bit of a spoiler. Maybe I shouldn't be spoiling these so much. But a lot of these stories, well, if there's a real surprise twist, then that one is sort of has a sense of inevitability about it. So I don't think I'm being too disrespectful by spoiling that one, because there's a certain sense of inevitability about where Jack goes and what choice Golden Boy makes when he's called upon to testify. But I'll try and be a little more discreet going forward. So then you've got the character who makes the cover of so many of these books, the flamboyant Dr. Tachyon. His initial presentation involves the fact that he's the one guy from this alien world that decided to experiment on humanity. Dr. Tachyon, as he ends up being called on Earth, is like the one man on that planet, which I believe is called Takis. That's how I pronounce it anyway, Takis. Technically, I don't think I've ever heard it spoken aloud, but I'm going to go ahead and say it's pronounced Takis. So the one man from Takis who decided it was barbaric and inhumane and cruel and awful to experiment on these hapless humans. So he came to Earth to try and stop it. And that didn't work out. So once the virus got loose, he was the man who dedicated his life to trying to help the victims, trying to come up with a cure, which he calls the Trump cure. In other words, trying to trump the wild card. Very early on, they established that he does succeed in creating a cure that is still very dangerous, where they say that I think originally the statistic they give is that it works 25% of the time. So some jokers get cured and turned back into human, but the risk being that the other 75%, if it doesn't work, it's quite likely to kill you. So he's now on Earth, kind of gets caught up in the whole. This story is by Melinda Snodgrass, and I really love. And I've always loved the way Melinda Snodgrass's story and the Walter John Williams Golden Boy story are told. They're told one after another. You read them sequentially, but they're set chronologically parallel. Really love the way that the two stories work in tandem when you read them back to back. Really, really brilliantly, beautifully done. Great editing on the part of George R. R. Martin and Melinda Snodgrass. Great writing on the part of both the writers. The stories kind of weave in and out of each other because they're both set. They both are set during the same era, from 1946 to 1950. Both of them climaxing with the HUAC trials, which, by the way, is awesome. And there's a review. Someone did a review on Goodreads where they actually said a review of Wild Cards where they said something like, "Hey, if I want to read a book about HUAC and the HUAC trials, I'll go to the library and get a book about the HUAC trials." And I thought, what the hell kind of thing is that to say? That book's got to be about something. Like what? So nobody can write a book about the HUAC trials unless, do they have to put the word HUAC in the title? Otherwise, you get blindsided by a story about HUAC when you didn't want to read that. That was so nonsensical to me. But it's also nonsensical because the stories are friggin' awesome. So how could you not want to read these? the HUAC stuff is in this book is gold. Anyway, so Dr. Tachyon ends up in a romantic relationship with one of Jack Braun, aka Golden Boy's teammates, Blythe, another name that I have no idea if I'm pronouncing right, Blythe Van Rensselaer, the only female member of the Four Aces, and so he and she get caught up in all the HUAC material as well. And once again, like with Golden Boy's story, it climaxes with the HUAC trials and the sort of tragedy surrounding that, the way so many lives in the real life were ruined by those trials. Really good stuff, really poignant, and I love the way those two stories kind of enrich each other in such a beautiful way. Really good stuff. And then Dr. Tachyon being an alien. Also very long-lived. Human lifespans are about 70 years, but apparently when you're from Takis, if you're a Takesian, you might live to be 1,000 or maybe even more than that. So Tachyon's another character who, even though he's already a full-grown adult in the 40s, he hasn't aged into senility, and he's not in a retirement home once you get up to the present day of the 1980s. So once again, they plant all these long-lived characters early on in the book. Quite a shrewd move, really. From there, you get two of the new stories that are only available in the Tor edition. I will say, generally speaking, if there are more than, what's the best way to put this? If there's a Tor edition, you probably want to get that version. If there are new stories, they didn't always do that. I believe right now, it's book 1, book 4, book 8, book 9, and book 16. Those are the ones where the Tor edition has new stuff that isn't in the other one. So in all, that's five books. In all 5 of those cases, you got to get the Tor version. I mean, we're all sci-fi nerds here, right? We can all admit that we're completists and we need to get everything, right? So you don't want to miss out. And in many cases, the new stories are really cool. This one, so in this one, we ended in 1950 with Tachyon and Golden Boy. Originally, we jumped from there all the way to 1963 with the George R.R. Martin story. But in the Tor version, there's 2 new stories. One set in 56 and the other set in 60. The one set in 56 is about kind of Wild Cards Hollywood, like sort of the golden age of Hollywood. Just sort of a vignette about some aces and jokers who work on a television series. Since there's the whole thing about Golden Boy being a Hollywood actor, there's a little bit of intersection with Golden Boy. And then from there, you go to David Levine, another name I don't know how to pronounce, Levine. He does a story about the 1960, the U-2 bomber that was piloted by, is it Gary Powers? Is that his name? The story that is called Powers. Double meaning, right? Ace powers, ace abilities, but also the name of the pilot, who was lost in the Soviet Union in 1960, piloting the U-2 plane. So one of those stories that is, it's very, very specific in its time period. It goes to kind of painstaking detail. Like, okay, it's May 2nd, it's May 3rd, 1960, it's May 5th, 1960. To get right in when in the real world it all went down. So in this version of history, this alternate version of history, an ace who gets ace who ends up working for the government under the code name Stopwatch, who can sort of freeze time, or slow time down, I should say, goes to the Soviet Union and makes a rescue attempt. Does he succeed? You'll have to read it to find out. Then we go to 1963, where we're introduced to another Wildcard's classic character called the Great and Powerful Turtle. Truly one of the, particularly when I was younger reading it, he's that, what's the right word? He's sort of a quintessential, almost like a Marvel Comics Silver Age. I mean, I think it's no accident that the story is set in 1963, because it's he's a teenager, a nerdy teenager with glasses, very in the Peter Parker mold. And I guess if you're a young sci-fi nerd, teenage sci-fi nerd yourself, there's sort of a lot to relate to when it comes to Thomas Tudbury, which is his real name. Great, kind of brilliant concept, I think. I always thought it was like a super cool concept, where basically he's one of the most powerful telekinetics in the world, can move just about anything with his mind. But he's not really a fighter, so it's not like he can go out and be a member of the X-Men or something, because he would just get beat up before he could ever use his telekinesis on you. He could just get punched in the face before he could even summon the mental energy. So what do you do in that situation? And so his solution is to armor himself up, which might make you think of, okay, Tony Stark, iron suit, looking badass. But instead, he just gets a VW Beetle, Volkswagen. What the hell am I saying? A VW Volkswagen? That's redundant, right? A VW Beetle, and puts battleship armor. So it looks like a big turtle shell basically, and he sits inside it. There's cameras arrayed around the outside so we can see, and he's just ensconced in his little womb, inside, this bulletproof turtle shell, which doesn't require, it's got computer monitors, and he puts. This is why it's such a great geek fantasy, because he's got snacks in there. He's got his little fridge so he can drink. He's got his tape deck. Later he upgrades to a CD player when it's later in the series. And so he's got his own little nest in there where he's perfectly safe. Bullets can't touch him. Doesn't need to create any kind of engine. It doesn't need to be aerodynamically sound, because he just can use his telekinesis to lift it up, fly wherever he wants, fight crime. Perfect way to conceal his identity, because he's got a voice distorter. He's got a PA system, so he can speak to people, but no one can really hear what his voice sounds like. Brilliant concept, like so smart, so much like what you can imagine someone really doing if they had superpowers and wanted to fight crime. But we're really dealing with the realities of, shoot, I don't want to get shot at, I want to feel completely safe at all times. So brilliant idea. So he's 18 years old in 1963. Not long lived like some of the other characters where they're ageless. Thomas Tudbury kind of ages in real time. So when we skip ahead to the mid 80s, this is the other great brilliant element of the turtle, is that when you skip into the 80s, now he's in his 40s, and he's just kind of even more, when he's not in the turtle shell, he's just even more of a sad sack. He already was kind of a sad sack even as a teenager. Now he's in his 40s, just like frumpy, lumpy, guy, pudgy guy in glasses, and doesn't really have much of a social life. Doesn't go the Peter Parker route of remaining trim and eventually marrying, Mary Jane, the supermodel. Tom Tudbury just stays very much a loser when he's not in the turtle shell. So yeah, fantastic concept. And the first story, the one set in 1963, is kind of cool because it's one of the first examples of a couple things. First of all, there's another sort of angle of the shared world scenario comes into play, where Tachyon is kind of left in a, again, trying not to be spoilery, but he's left in kind of a bad place at the end of the Melinda Snodgrass Tachyon story, Snodgrass being the creator of that character. And it's sort of like, oh, that's it. It's a tragic ending for Tachyon. But then he comes back in a story written by George R.R. Martin, and he's a lead character. He's not just a supporting character. He kind of sort of shares the lead with Turtle, and he's able to actually have a bit of a redemption arc. And so it's one of the first stories where you start to see the potential of like, a different writer other than the creator of the character can come in and have have something really major happen to him. He's not just there. Just it's not like again to look at like the comic book analogies, the Marvel comics of like issue 10 of the Turtle, special guest appearance by Tachyon. It's more intense than that. It's more in depth than that, where you can actually get a fully fleshed out character arc happening over the course of multiple stories by multiple writers, and also have one story accomplishing two things, where it's both providing like a second half of Tachyon's arc in the book, but also starting an arc for this Thomas Tudbury character in the same story, which is just like super cool. And it's like where you start to say, oh, okay, there's a lot of different angles to this whole shared world idea. There's lots of possibilities. It's not just like, here's a story, and here's another story, here's another story. There's all this interweaving and interplay. The other element that George R. R. Martin really brings in, starting with that turtle story, is a location called Jokertown, which is sort of, as the name implies, it's what you might expect, where it's like this sort of ghetto for jokers. So it's this place that's just filled with mutants, and there's right from the start, right from that first turtle story, it was pretty much where the reader meets Jokertown. It's just this place, it's a very seamy place where there's lots of intrigue, crime. It's kind of very gritty, but there's this extra element of the scary people that you might meet on the street are not just scary because they have a gun, but they might also just be pretty monstrous. But then, of course, there are also empathetic characters who are jokers, but are also very human. Characters like Xavier Desmond, which is one of the great Joker characters, who is described in this as his mutation being almost comical, where he's got mostly looks human, but he's got like a trunk, and then at the end of the trunk are little fingers, which almost sounds like a cartoon character or a Muppet. But then the way Martin writes him, he's got this sort of dignity and intelligence and depth to him that again starts to make you realize just all the different sort of things that are possible in a world like Wild Cards, where there can be so much subversion of expectations and different ways of different metaphors that can be explored just through this one core concept of this alien virus. So yeah, really cool story. I think from there it jumps to one of my favorites, which is called Transfigurations by Vic Milan. Actually, it's hard to pick a favorite in the first book. There's a lot of good ones, but I love Transfigurations. It was one that I was, again, maybe I shouldn't read these reviews on Goodreads because they baffle me sometimes. Where several of those Goodreads reviews were doing what I'm doing now. Story 1, story 2, and doing a little blurb on each one, talking about, and when they would get to Transfigurations, they would say, I didn't really understand what the point of this one was, which just baffled me because, I mean, there's so much in that one. There's so much, it's so dense just in terms of thematically and plot and character. There's so much you could take from it. Even if it isn't what Vic Milan intended, you could take something away from it. It boggled me that people were like, there just didn't seem to be a point, when I feel like you could draw any number of points from that, even points that Vic Milan didn't intend to make. Transfigurations. So Transfigurations is a cool one. It's like I mentioned earlier, I love when they have the Wild Cards world sort of explore a musical era, or musical movements, or just elements of pop culture that involved pop music or rock music. And Transfigurations is the first, still maybe the one by which all others are measured, where it's during the Vietnam War. It's set over pretty much over a particular college year, fall of 1969 to spring of 1970, climaxing in right around the time of the Kent State incident. Although it's not, you don't actually, it would probably be in poor taste to actually have something set during that incident, but it's set around that time, and that milieu, and the sort of the Vietnam protests, and what was going on with protesters and the soldiers, and et cetera, et cetera. But also exploring the music of the era through a what would you call it, an avatar of. Sorry for all those chimes. It's beautiful women trying to message me and saying, "Tell me more about wild cards." It's my cross to bear. So an avatar or a fictionalized version of Jim Morrison, where they wisely don't call him Jim Morrison. There are fictionalized versions of a lot of characters in wild cards, and sometimes they just call them that. The fictionalized version of Marilyn Monroe is named Marilyn Monroe. But then there are others, Jim Morrison being one, let's say Donald Trump is another, where they don't call them by those names. So the Jim Morrison sort of stand-in is called Tom Douglas. And he's an ace, a wild card rock singer who sort of galvanizes the young people and the protest movement. And he ends up in a fight with what they sometimes refer to as the establishment ace, who's this very, very conservative blue collar ace with super strength, who ends up in this big fight with the Lizard King, Tom Douglas, and the fight kind of goes in the establishment's favor. The establishment ace being Hard Hat starts to go in his favor until a second radical ace shows up, a second liberal ace, calling himself the Radical, very much on the nose, hippie, long hair, has a medallion around his neck that's a peace sign medallion, which you might think, oh, that's a bit on the nose, but that's actually part of the point, because what makes the story so brilliant is that the real lead character of the story is Mark Meadows, who is a kind of another nerdy guy, kind of in that turtle mode, who sort of wants to be a hippie, but really only wants to be a hippie kind of to impress a girl, and doesn't really have that inclination. But he ends up finally dropping acid, even though he's scared to do that for most of the story. And then when he does, he turns into sort of exactly what the girl of his dreams wants, which is this like perfect, idealized hippie, radical figure. And then the twist is that after about 24 hours, the acid trip wears off, and he's back to just being Mark Meadows. And when he takes acid again, he doesn't turn into the Radical again. And so he ends up, as some of the writers have put it, he ends up kind of chasing that first high, trying to get the Radical back. So he goes on this quest to find the Radical. I feel like even just if you'd never read the story, but you just listen to my synopsis, how can you, surely you can see right away, like, oh, I can see what the author was maybe getting at with that story. I see why he would want to write a story like that. Maybe it's something to say about the hippie movement or the establishment. I'm baffled that anyone could be baffled by that one, that they could wonder what the point was when it's so explicitly about something. I don't know. Maybe we're just too far away from it now. I mean, at the time that the book came out in 1970, it was only a decade and a half earlier, whereas now it's more like 50 years. So maybe that has something to do with it. But there's definitely a point, and it's definitely a very rich story. There's a lot going on, even beyond the plot that I just sort of described. Another interesting thing about this first book, or a striking thing, and I think with the Mark Meadows story, that's when you really see it begin, is in some ways these stories are like pilot episodes. It's almost like you're watching pilot season of a whole raft of superhero programming, which at the time would have been very novel. Nowadays, it's like, sounds like something that could easily actually happen. The Netflix be like, we're watching 6 pilots, all about a different superhero. But when you go, I skipped one of the stories. So it actually starts with the previous one, The Long Dark Night of Fortunato. So it's the Turtle story, and then the Fortunato story, and then Vic Milan's Transfigurations about Mark Meadows. But that's where it starts. Long Dark Night of Fortunato, Transfigurations, Down Deep, Strings, even Ghost Girl, Comes a Hunter. What is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's like 6 stories in here that really do feel kind of like pilot episodes where Mark Meadows' story really doesn't feel like it ends because it's really like he wants to find the radical and he's going on a quest to become the radical once again. And that's the start of something. It doesn't necessarily feel at the end of that story that you've read the end of it, but more like a beginning. Long Dark Night of Fortunato, which I didn't mean to skip, where it's about that his character is that character is a pimp called Fortunato. I don't know that we ever learned like what his name is. Like he already has this sort of handle. I guess just being a pimp, you have a handle. I don't know. It's set in 1969. I don't know what pimps did back then, but even before he discovers his ace power, he already has kind of an ace code name, which is Fortunato. But he uses his ace power to try and stop a serial killer who's killing prostitutes, including the prostitutes that work for him. Him being a pimp. So he manages to stop the guy, but then through his powers, which are pretty intense. Fortunato is one of the high-powered characters in the series. Can do a lot of different stuff. Read minds, cause time to slow down. He can fly. He can send his astral self out flying and do a lot of different stuff. Kind of just manipulate energy. And when he finds this guy who's been killing prostitutes, he tries to read his mind, and his mind has been kind of wiped clean. And it becomes clear that there was something else going on, that this guy wasn't just some random loony, but he was killing people for some kind of satanic purpose, or what's implied to be some kind of ritualistic, 5-pointed star type stuff. So there's clearly like a thing going on there. And then the story ends with Fortunato kind of being like, I'm going to figure this out, see what's going on. So again, feels more like a pilot episode than a self-contained short story. From there, we get a lot of that kind of thing. So then the next story is Down Deep, about a man who can turn into an alligator. He's kind of like the Hulk, except the big green monster he turns into is not a man, but an alligator. And because he turns into an animal, he happens to end up connected to a woman whose ace power is to sort of telepathically communicate with animals. So that's Sewer Jack is the alligator man, and then Vagabond, which is a word I've never quite... I guess it's a pun on Bag Lady and Vagabond, because she is sort of both those things. I don't see how that's quite a play on her ace power of controlling animals, but hey, someone in the comments can correct me on why, if there's a layer to that name that I'm missing. But again, those characters sort of become friends, and I think they even, it's sort of implied that they move in together, because Sewer Jack has this sort of underground layer. Kind of a joke on the whole idea of like there are alligators in the New York sewers. Yes, there is. There's one. This guy who turns into alligators and lives underground. And so Vagabond, instead of being sort of like a homeless vagabond, she ends up taking shelter with him, and they become friends. And the first book kind of implies that maybe romance will bloom. And I don't know if that was the original plan, because it's not really how things go down. So I don't know if they're deliberately setting that up in order to frustrate those expectations, or if they really were going to pair them off and then decided to change that. But again, almost feels like a pilot episode. It's like, here's, if there was a TV show called Sewer Jack and Vagabond, here's the pilot where you find out how they met. Did I say Down Deep? Long Dark Night of Fortunato was written by Louis Shiner. Transfigurations is, of course, Victor Milan. Down Deep is a collaboration between Edward Bryant, who created Sewer Jack, and Leanne C. Harper, who created Vagabond. And then it goes to Strings, the story by Stephen Lee. His story is a little different. It has a sort of kind of a horror / mystery vibe that some of the other ones don't. A lot of them are, I guess you could argue that a lot of them have different sort of genres that they flirt with, even though obviously they're superhero stories in a lot of ways. But, Tachyons is kind of almost like a tragic romance, the Melinda Snodgrass Tachyon story. well, even Walter John Williams is almost like almost feels like historical drama almost in a way, always mixing with historical drama meets superhero or tragic romance meets superhero. Strings is kind of feels almost more like horror or suspense, where there's this there's an ace called Puppet Man, and who's clearly a villain and kind of a horrible monster, and there's just some really awful stuff that this Puppet Man is doing, but he's only ever referred to as Puppet Man, and his story is kind of told in parallel to this other drama, this kind of political drama that's taking place between several characters. And there's a little bit of misdirection as far as which of the characters is Puppet Man. One of them clearly is, but it's written in such a way where you don't necessarily know for sure. I have no idea how that plays because I read so many spoilers before I actually started these books that I knew right away who it was. It didn't really even occur to me when I first read it that it was a mystery because I already knew. It wasn't until I reread the books much later and tried to just kind of blank my mind and read the Puppet Man story and went, oh yeah, I see. He's playing it a bit mysterious. So there's like a mystery suspense element, and then there's also like some really horrific scenes in there that really, I think, take it into a realm that's more horror than sci-fi. Which is one of the great things about these books is that you do get that, like all these different genres kind of mixed in, following whatever interests the various authors involved. That, like I've said, I think I probably said it in the first video, that mix of different authorial voices leads to a mix of genres, leads to a mix of tone, of different tones, different pacing. I mean, that variety is really fantastic. Again, it's one of the big selling points. And I guess I didn't say Down Deep with Sewer Jack and Vagabond, not set in 1972. Down Deep is set in 76. I'm sorry, Down Deep is 72. Strings, the Puppet Man story, is 76. And then we jump to 1980 or 81, that punk new wave movement, which is a new story written by Carrie Vaughn for the newer edition, the Tor edition of Volume 1. It's just great. It's a great story. She takes a character who originally was introduced in the third book, and the character's name is Jennifer Malloy, and then her ace name is Wraith. There's kind of a good gag in this story where she's called Ghost Girl because she hasn't thought of her name yet, because this is 2 books before her original debut in book 3. So she's not calling herself Wraith yet because she hasn't thought of it yet. Good little bit. A lot of clever little bits like that in these stories. If you're a fan, they throw you a lot of fun little bits like that. Jennifer Malloy, aka Ghost Girl, aka Wraith, goes to a concert at CBGB's and has sort of an adventure in New York City. Very, very light in tone, which is actually really nice sequencing, actually, putting it right after Strings, which is like pretty intense and graphic. So yeah, I really love that story. I love that edition, the Ghost Girl one. And then it jumps to what at the time was sort of like Wild Card's The Present Day. It sort of jumps to 1985, and the book came out in 87. So you figure, I think I said in the first video that the books move along in real time, but always on average about on a 2-year delay. So usually, like, if you buy a Wild Cards book, say in like 2008, it's probably set in 2006 or something like that. So we get to 1985 and we get like kind of a look at the present day Wild Cards. Once again, we're in Jokertown. We're in that sort of seamy environment of kind of danger and mutants and stuff. And John Joseph Miller, I said Carrie Vaughn wrote Ghost Girl, right? Ghost Girl takes Manhattan as Carrie Vaughn, and then John Joseph Miller writes the final story in the volume set in 1985. And it's it's an interesting one. It makes for an interesting bookend because it once again is about someone who is not an ace nor a joker, just a normal guy, much like Jet Boy was at the start of the book. So you get this kind of bookend of like normal people, no superpowers, but just some kind of extraordinary skill that lets them sort of compete in the world of superhumans. In the case of Jet Boy, his sort of amazing skill was that he was this sort of savant when it came to piloting aircraft. where he started flying when he was only 13 or whatever it is. In the case of the character Daniel Brennan in the final story called Comes a Hunter, code name, his vigilante name is Yeoman. His skill is archery, so no powers, but almost superhumanly good at the bow and arrow. So he comes to New York with this sort of vendetta, very 80s action movie, or The Punisher would be another touchstone. The sort of idea of like, you killed my family, prepare to die, kind of a deal. With the twist being that he's not out there like shooting people with a gun in each hand. He's doing a bow and arrow, which is a pretty good twist. And again, another pilot episode kind of deal, because he wants revenge on this crime lord. Daniel Brennan does. Does he get revenge by the end of the story? No, but he decides, because he's come from, I can't remember where he's meant to be living at the start of the story, somewhere alone in isolation, until he learns that the crime lord that he hates is in New York City. So he comes to the city, and at the end of the story decides he's going to have to stay there until he can finally take down this crime lord. But he doesn't actually take him down in that first story. So again, feels like a pilot episode. It's a lot of setup in the first book. I think the stories are still satisfying because they have that element of feeling like a snapshot, not only a snapshot of a certain time in the 20th century America, although it's certainly that, but also just sort of snapshots of different style of characters, even though you don't necessarily get the Turtles' full character arc in that first story, because there are still more Turtle stories to come. But you get right away, it's like that snapshot. It's like, oh, that Peter Parker archetype, Yeoman is that 1980s action movie kind of archetype, that you get even in the snapshot. And on and on and on, all these characters, Fortunato is, people have pointed out that it's almost like, because it's set in the 60s, it's almost like a blaxploitation type film. So they all feel like sort of snapshots of not just of the actual era through this lens of superheroes, but also snapshots of the pop culture of the era, whether it's the comic books of the time or the movies, film, television, whatever. In that sense of variety really does. I think most readers have agreed, most fans have agreed that it gives the first book a sense of being really full, like a full meal. Even though there are loose ends left with these certain characters, like with Mark Meadows searching for the radical, Fortunato trying to figure out the mystery of those murders, Yeoman with his vendetta, Puppet Man and his deprivations, etc., etc. Even though you don't get closure on any of that stuff, it still feels like a complete reading experience. And then from there, what you get over the course of the next few books, maybe I might flash up a little screenshot. I did for fun. I sort of did this kind of color-coded Excel spreadsheet where I sort of kind of looked at, because what happens going forward from the first book, the sagas of these individual characters, which do intersect with all the other characters to give it that sense of a lived-in shared world, they still sort of have their trajectory. And it still generally is the author / creator of the characters who will guide their particular character from one adventure to the next. So, for example, in book 2, Victor Milan contributes, George R. R. Martin contributes, Melinda Snodgrass contributes, Roger Zelazny contributes. All people who contributed to the first book come back to contribute to the second, which means that you get another Mark Meadows story, because Milan is back, another Turtle story, because Martin is back, another Tachyon story, because Snodgrass is back, and another story about the Sleeper, because Roger Zelazny is back. But Edward Bryant and Leanne C. Harper don't contribute to the second book, so there is no Sewer Jack in there is no Vagabond. But then when you get to book 3 and you see Edward Bryant's name on that one and Leanne C. Harper's name on that one, and then when you open it up, there they are, having an adventure, Sewer Jack and Vagabond. Whereas, Vic Milan doesn't contribute to book 3, and neither does Roger Zelazny. So the Sleeper ends up, so like the Sleeper and Mark Meadows are in there, but they're not lead characters. They're sort of just in there as like supporting characters. Generally speaking, you can count on an author being the guiding guru of their character. I left out some examples too with the second book, because Louis Shiner contributes to book 2, which means there's another Fortunato story, and John Joseph Miller contributes to book 2, which means there's another Yeoman story. Yeah, so generally speaking, the way the sort of shape of the saga is that if you were to hypothetically say, oh, I only want to follow the adventures of the turtle, it would be like, oh, well, then you want to read book 1, book 2, maybe book 3, but because he's a little bit in there. But then book 5, it would be an important one. The ones where he's a point of view character, probably being written by his creator, George R.R. Martin. Same with Mark Meadows, where Mark Meadows, he's in the first 2 books, and then he kind of becomes just a supporting character for a long time. After the first 2 books, you don't get much Mark, but then starting with like book 8, Vic Milan is contributing some Mark Meadows material to almost every book. So all of a sudden, Mark Meadows is very important in 8, in 9, in 10. He's written by Melinda Snodgrass, but he's very important there. In 12, he's very important. 14, 15. So the experience of reading the books, and I'm sure I'll say this more than once, is of sort of, there's this sense of like characters being juggled, where favorite characters will be there for you sometimes, and every time they show up, you're like, hey, I love that guy. I'm glad he's in this one. Then they might go away for a couple of books, but the whole thing, but there are these overarching arcs too. So the way these characters kind of intermingle and mix. Puppet Man is another example where Puppet Man is clearly a villain when you read about him. Even though you read from his perspective, he's not a good guy. So when Puppet Man is pretty much absent from 2 and 3, because I think Stephen Lee doesn't contribute anything to 2 or 3, prose-wise, doesn't contribute a story. So when Stephen Lee comes back for book 4, suddenly it's all about Puppet Man. And, so it's got that. I guess it's kind of almost like a soap opera. It's not quite. I feel like it's not quite the same as a soap opera because I don't think you lose track of a character doesn't go dark for quite as long in a soap opera and then come back, because you've got your cast of actors and you want them to be in every episode. There's some soap operatic elements to the Wildcard saga for sure, but the experience of reading it is much more. There's much more interweaving. It's not like, here's our cast of 8 characters and you're going to follow them on their soap opera every episode. It's more like, here's our cast of 11 characters in book 1, and then in book 2 maybe 7 of them come back, but the other 4 don't. But 4 or 5 new ones show up, and then in the third book it'll be like maybe half of the people from book 1, but then also half of the people from book 2 will intermingle and be involved in that story, and then book 4 comes along. And there are 6 new characters, but still the return of some of your favorites from the first 3 books. So it's got that kind of quality to it, which creates the sort of cool experience of being able to sort of, pick your favorites and sort of cheer when they come back if they've been gone for a long time. If you're a fan of the series, you probably have more than one favorite. Otherwise, you might get a little frustrated when your favorite goes away. But I personally really like The Sleeper. I really love Mark Meadows. Golden Boy is great. Those are the examples that jump out at me from the first book. Mark Meadows is actually my favorite character of the whole series, which is why that Vic Milan's Transfigurations is my favorite story in book 1. Obviously, like the turtle is a favorite character. Golden Boy. And with every book, there are more characters that I really enjoy following. And I think that's true of every Wildcards fan, where they've got their sort of stable of favorites that they love to see whenever those guys show up. I guess for these early episodes, it seems to make sense to use a single book as a departing point, and then use that as sort of a jumping off point to just talk about general things that I like about the series, or appealing elements, or characteristic elements of the series as a whole. But picking one book seems to be a good way to, I guess, give the episode some focus, because otherwise I have no focus. Let's end there. So we'll call that episode 2 of Card Table. And next time, in episode 3, we will look at book 2, which is titled Aces High. Leave comments if there's things you think this series needs. Definitely would love to hear from Wildcards fans and what. Basically, I'm creating this because as a Wildcards fan, I kind of wanted some content like this, like some YouTube show that I could watch or listen to. So if you're a fan and thinking, oh, what I really want from a YouTube thing about Wildcards is A, B, and C, let me know in the comments, and I will try to make those adjustments and try to create something that fills the gap that every Wildcards fan has been feeling in their life. All right, until then, talk to you later.
Have any class? She says, "Hon, what is it?" "I'm trying to visit with my pal Melinda Snodgrass. Shoot the breeze with Walter John Williams. Hang out with Howard Waldron. I've been smarting for George R.R. Martin. His characters have so much power. I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. My heart's broken several places. Baby's just sitting there reading about aces."